Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. Thank you for joining me, whether you are watching here with me live or you're watching the recording a little bit later on. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Today we're going to be talking about our basic CSS properties, the things that kind of take the site from something that's kind of boring and bland and make it into something that's kind of interesting. Specifically, we're going to be talking about color, and we're going to be talking about font formatting. But before we get into that, just a quick announcement or two. I should be able to post all of the rest of the material for the remainder of the semester later today. That's going to be my goal. That's going to be what I'm going to try to do. I've got one more module to build and then to shore up the final project. So I should be able to have your JavaScript module, your PHP module, your MySQL module, and your final project / final exam into the course today. Fingers crossed. So be on the lookout for that. Well, we are talking about these basic CSS properties today. And before we get into them, I just kind of want to talk about why we cover these basic CSS properties as opposed to, any of the myriad of, hundreds of CSS properties that are out there available. And it's typically because, at this level, right, we've got this certain scope of people. Some of you will be continuing on with me into further web development courses, programming courses. Some of you won't. Right, but when it comes to like building and designing a website, there's a certain handful of things that people want to be able to do. They want to be able to change the color of things, right? Make something a certain color. And they want to be able to change like the text formatting, the same basic kind of things that you would be able to do to like a Word document as you were setting up a Word document. You want to be able to change different colors, and you want to be able to change how your text looks. And that's essentially what this module is about. And really, when it comes to color is one of the things that is more difficult than you might expect. Right? Like, we talk about color in a certain way, but we essentially talk about color, and in talking about color, we kind of upheave it from the things that you might have learned, that you might have taken for granted and known as true your entire life. Like back when you're in preschool, back when you're in first grade, you're taught that your primary colors are a certain thing. You're taught that your primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. And these colors, red, yellow, and blue, you mix them together and they make other colors, right? Your secondary colors. So like red plus blue makes purple, red plus yellow makes orange, blue and yellow make green, right? Like these are the things that we learn when we're really small and we're in preschool, we're in kindergarten, we're in first grade. We learn these things. But now that we're learning digital color is an entirely different thing than that old school sort of subtractive color that we used to do with paint and crayons. With digital color, what we're using is light, and light handles color differently. So things will be very different. So I'm just going to kind of throw that down right now as we're getting started today, just to make you aware that things might be very different and probably more difficult than you could have ever imagined. Just based around the idea of color, because like we know colors and we know what colors are. But, as we've seen so far, right, essentially by default, everything on a website is either black or white. And, we were looking at last week, we were making this site, and this is the same site we'll be using for our demonstration today. Right, we were making this site to show ourselves our different box model properties, and we were doing different things with it. We'll go ahead and open this up in a new tab just so we can see it. This is what we made, or what we had made by the end of the live stream last week. Too simple, right? Easy just stuff, just looking at box model stuff. So we're going to use that same base today to build off of with our colors and our fonts and such. But one of the first things that you pretty much always want to customize is color, because everything's black and white by default, and black and white is boring. And in CSS, we have several different ways of customizing the colors that we use for HTML elements. And we can customize the foreground color, which in our case is going to be the color of the text, or a background color, which is going to be the color behind our text. But the first way, and probably the easiest way for us to do things, is by utilizing named colors. So all modern browsers, whether you're using Edge, whether you're using Chrome, whether you're using Firefox, whatever you're using, Safari, all modern browsers support 140 named colors. Now I want you to keep that number in mind there. 140 colors. Right, because that's going to be like one of the big downfalls of this idea of named colors. All of our modern browsers support 140 named colors, and these named colors have a specified name that when we refer to them as such in CSS, it gives us that specific color. Now, I have a list of all 140 named colors, and we can see that right here. And there are all sorts of names here for all these different colors. Some of them make a lot of sense. Some of them don't make as much sense. Right? Like if you just heard the name Papaya Whip, what exactly, what kind of color does that bring forward in your mind? That might be something that's a little more difficult to understand. But if we look at Papaya Whip, which is right here, it is sort of a pale orange. Right, and so all of these are kind of colors that have already been defined as colors in our browser's color palette. It understands them, and we can refer to any of these by name. Right? A lot of them make sense, some of them don't. It's kind of the difference between, well, I understand what lime is or what sea green is versus what Papaya Whip is or what Gainsborough is. Right? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's why we, typically have a list like this to refer to it. So we have a lot of colors here, and I'm just going to pick one just off the top of my head. One of the ones that I like here. Let's look through. Let's see what we've got. You know what? Let's just go with a nice dark salmon right here. Dark salmon underneath tomato. Or you know what? I think I kind of like tomato better. So I'm going to use tomato here today. So now that we've seen this list of colors, these are kind of our standard list of colors. Let's talk about how we can take this list of colors. And also, I think I've linked this in your module. But if I haven't, you can always Google CSS named colors, and it'll give you this whole list. So now let's talk about how we can actually use one of these named colors in our code. And we do that by approaching first our color property, right? And when we say color here, what we're talking about is we're talking about the text color. We're talking about the foreground color. So just the word color on its own in CSS is referring to the foreground color, the color of the text. And so we see our simple CSS syntax here. We're using our selector to select something. In this case, we're using our H1 element selector. We could be using a class selector. We could be using an ID selector. Again, doesn't really matter. We use the term color, and then we add our named color after it. So we could do something similar in our example that we've been working on here. We have this site, again, that we were working on last week. Right now, no color. Let's add some color to it. In my CSS file, I see that, we have these different elements that we've done here. We have our, paragraph, text element, element selector, we have our hashtag big ID selector here with all the rules that we put into it. That's this big paragraph here. We have our H1 element selector, which I believe is our hello world here at the top. Paragraph 1, P1 class selector, which is here. And then the image that we have down here at the bottom. And so one of the things that we can do with this right off the bat is we can use these on our borders that we started last time. So for example, we'll take this P1, or you know what, we'll take our H1 element selector here, our hello world, and we'll change the border color, and we'll change the color of the text so it'll match, right? We'll have a nice, or you know what, maybe I'll use 2 here. Maybe we'll have a nice dark salmon border. So in order to have and let me switch the view here. In order to have a colored border, we're just going to tack that onto the end of our border syntax that we looked at previously. So I'm going to write dark salmon. Here, and one of the great things about these named colors, as you can see there, as we started typing the named colors, we got a whole list of these colors come up that, you know, kind of meets this criteria of this kind of autocomplete here. And, you know, that's because, again, you know, our browsers and in turn our IDEs, because they are common colors, they're a list of 140 colors that are sort of understood to be regular colors. It knows them, so when we start typing them, it's going to recognize them. Which is cool, right? And so we have this list of 140 colors, and really, well, I'll save this for just a minute. Let's go ahead and add this. We can just go ahead and click our run button and see that in action. We can see that we've now changed the color of that border. That's around our hello world. And we can change the color of our text by adding our color rule and adding tomato or whatever we want to add there as that color. So now we have tomato colored text with a dark salmon colored border, which is pretty cool, right? Doing a lot of good work here. Now, one of the things that I really like about having a limited color palette with those named colors is that oftentimes, especially when you're getting started, like you end up with kind of what we have termed, or what we can term, the crisis of choice. And in just a few minutes here, we'll talk about how you can get a near infinite number of colors. And it's not a near infinite number of colors. It's roughly 4 million, which isn't even close to infinity. But it is way more colors than 140. But you get this near infinite, we'll just say, number of choices when we're using color codes versus when we're using our named colors, right? We only have 140 named colors. And you might think, well, that's not a whole lot of colors, and it's not. Right, but when you're making a project and you're making a project from scratch, one of the good things about having a limited color palette like this is that you don't get stuck in the idea of trying to choose the perfect color. When you have a near infinite number of choices, you know, we call it the crisis of choice. Right? When you have so many things that you can pick from, it's hard to pick anything, right? Because we have so many choices. But when we have a limited number, it's a lot easier to pick specific things and use them for, you know, whatever we need. Which is pretty cool. But if you're working for a company, right, and they have specific colors that are a part of their brand that they want put on their website, or you just want a specific color, there's a high degree of likelihood that it is not found within this 140 colors here. And so that's why we end up with color codes. Because obviously there are more colors than what are available to us via color names, right? There are way more colors than that. And actually, I misquoted a few minutes ago. I said 4 million. It's actually more like 16 million. We have 16, almost 17 million colors that are available to us in the visible spectrum of light. And in CSS, we can define these colors in multiple different ways. RGB/RGBA, HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. For those of you who are continuing on with me, we'll cover those in the spring. For the time being, the only color code that we're going to look at here is hexadecimal color. And this is where we kind of get into this idea that color is maybe a little more difficult than what we learned about back when we were in preschool, kindergarten, you know, back when we were like 5 years old, within that range. Because you've probably seen hexadecimal colors. You've probably seen them, right? We start a hexadecimal color with a hashtag, like so. And then we followed that hashtag with a triplet, right? And in this case, a triplet is going to be a 3-byte hexadecimal number represented by 6 digits. So essentially what we have is 3 pairs of 2 digits, right? So we might see something like 7B, 9618. And you've probably seen something like this before. And I'm actually going to take and write this random color here that I just generated down. Write this, let's see, what have I made here? It's something in the brown family. This is a really ugly color. Let me just write this down here for just a minute. 7B 9618. We'll approach what this is in just a little bit. I just pulled these digits off the top of my head. But this is something that you've probably seen before, and this is how we represent colors in hexadecimal. Now you might be saying, what is hexadecimal? Well, let's have a look at that. Right, when we're looking at hexadecimal, we're looking at this, these pairs of numbers, right? So we have these 3 sets of pairs of numbers. In our case, it's 7B 9618. And now we say these are numbers, right? But we see this letter B in here. What does that mean? Well, in hexadecimal, which is the numbering style that we're using, there's actually 16 different digits to represent a number, right? In our normal numbering system, which is decimal, we have 10 digits. And these digits are 0 to 9. And then we represent every other number that we have using a combination of these digits. So, you know, like 16 is a 1 and a 6. 78 is a 7 and an 8, right? Every number that's made up is made up of one of these 10 digits in some kind of order. You know, one or more of these 10 digits in some kind of order. Conversely, with our hexadecimal system, which is also just shortened to hex, this uses 16 digits. So we're using 0 through 9, just like we're using in decimal, but then we continue counting. And since we don't really have new numbers that we can count that with, we continue counting by using A through F. And this would be the rough equivalent of counting 1, or actually counting 0 to 16. Right? So if we were to kind of lay this out, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, these are all the same. They're going to, if we were to convert those into decimal, they'd be the same. But when we got to, say, A would be representative of 10, B would be representative 11, C 12, D 13, E 14, and F 15. Right? So if we take all of the characters between 0 and F, that's 16 characters. That's our base 16 versus our base 10 in decimal. So now that we have this understanding of kind of what these numbers are, and we're using these different digits in these different places, right? We said these are pairs. So we're using these different digits in these different places, just like we would create like the number 10 in decimal. We have a 0 in the ones place and a 1 in the tens place. These numbers have one digit in the first place and one digit in the second place. And we'll talk about what those places are in just a little bit. Right? Before we get into that, let's talk about what these pairs are. These pairs represent the intensity of our color. And when we're talking about color like this, we're talking about our primary colors, which are red, green, and blue. So the first pair represents our color red, the second pair represents our color green, and the third pair represents our color blue. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought you just said these are primary colors. I learned in elementary school primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Now you're telling me they're red, green, and blue, and that's correct. When we're dealing with white, or when we're dealing with light, rather, we're dealing with color in an additive color space, which means what we're doing is we're taking different intensities of these values of light and we're mixing them together. You know, if you've ever gotten up really close to a television or really close to a computer monitor, or maybe you spilled like a little droplet of water on a television or computer monitor, you can see these tiny little pixels kind of representing themselves on their screen. You know, you've magnified them through that droplet of water. And you'll see that they're red, green, and blue. And we can create all of these 16 million colors based on different intensities of red, green, and blue. And what these numbers represent here, once we convert them, is some intensity value between 0 and 255. Right? 0 essentially means there's no intensity, none at all. And 255 means it's full intensity. So it's as much intensity as you can possibly get on it. And when we take these different combinations, we're having 0 to 255 intensity red, 0 to 255 intensity green, 0 to 255 intensity blue. And we represent them in this hexadecimal because we can do it in these two-digit pairs that can kind of standardize our color codes so we can use them as we are developing. So what numbers do these fall in? Right? Like, how could we convert these hex numbers to decimal numbers so we can understand where they fall in this intensity range of 0 to 255. And that has to do with the place values of our digits here. Right? And so if we look at a hexadecimal number, in this case we're looking at a two-digit hexadecimal number, we can break it down thusly. You know, just like when we're dealing with our decimal here, our first place is 10 to the 1, or rather 10 to the 0, 10 to the 0, 10 to the 1, 10 squared, right? Because that's ones, tens, and hundreds. In our hexadecimal, it's similar, but since we're base 16, we're using everything based on the number 16. Right? So our first place is 10 to the 0, and our second place is 16 to the 1. So 16 to the 0, 16 to the 1. If you remember back to some basic algebra, or really this is just basic mathematics, right? Like this is something that you probably should have learned in elementary school, maybe 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. We have these basic powers. right? Anything raised to the power of 0 is always 1. Anything raised to the power of 1 is always itself, in this case 16. So we can just take the value that's represented by our digit, multiply it by its place value, add them together, and we get that corresponding decimal value. So for example, here we have 7b. Now, according to our little conversion here, we said that b is 11. So we can look at this b as it were an 11. So 11 times 1, that is 11. 7 times 16. It's too early on a Monday morning for me to do math, so I'm going to pull out the calculator really quickly. 7 times 16 equals 112. 112. So then we add these numbers together, and that gives us 123. So the red intensity value, which is going to fall somewhere between 0 and 255, is 123. So our red light is shining at an intensity of 123. If we were to look at this in relation to our green light, that's 96. 6 times 1 is 6. 9 times 16 is 144. Right, so that's 144 plus 6, that's 150, right? So for our second value here, for our green value, our green is at an intensity of 150. And our blue value here is at an intensity of 18. 8 times 1 is 8. 1 times 16 is 16. So that's 24. Our blue intensity value is 24. And from these digits, you can see, like, you can kind of get this indication of what the color is going to look like, right? Because the more we mess with these different color intensities, the more we kind of get the idea of, well, whatever has the most intensity is going to be the dominant color here. So we have this green color here. It has the most intensity, even though it's not by much. So it's going to be dominant. So our green is going to be the dominant color because it has the greatest intensity. However, it's pretty close in color, or rather it's pretty close in intensity to the amount of intensity that red has. Right, which means this is actually going to be closer to a yellow. So maybe a little more green than yellow, so we might get a slightly lime tinged color, right? But the other thing to kind of look at here is that this is dark, right? We're only roughly halfway in our scale in the number of intensities. So this is going to be in more of a kind of a brown area, kind of a really dirty, really ugly color, right? And we can check that. And one of the easiest ways to check it is just by Googling the color hash, right? If you Google the color hash, it will give you the response. And so we see it's this kind of, I mean, I actually kind of like that color, but it's this kind of puke green. You know, we said it would be green dominant. We said it would be on the lime side, which is exactly what we're looking at. And we said it'd be a little bit darker. Right, I actually kind of like that color, but it's probably not a color that would be one that would be used most often. And then we also see here, Google gives us these values here, which are the exact values that we calculated. 123, 150, and 24. So this is just another way to represent colors, and it's another way to represent a bunch of colors. Right, and so as we're looking at this, we can start to see how kind of our colors are mixed and made. Right, so for example, if we are working with our colors and we have 2 times the amount of red than we do green, that's going to give us something that's orange. because we've already said that green plus red gives us yellow. If we were doing red plus blue, in this case, that's magenta. So if we have equal intensities of red and blue, that's going to be somewhere in my magenta family. If we have equal intensities of blue and green, that's going to be somewhere in my cyan family. And then if we have equal representation of all of them, red plus blue plus green in equal amounts, that's going to be somewhere in the grayscale. That's going to be, when we mix all of our lights in equal intensities, that's going to be somewhere between black and white. When they're all 0, for example, hashtag 000000, that's pretty equal to calculate, easy to calculate, right? That's 0 intensity red, 0 intensity green, 0 intensity blue. So that's going to be black. And if we have FF, 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 which is as high as we can get, that's 255 intensity red, 255 intensity green, 255 intensity blue. That's every light as intense as it possibly can be. That's going to be our white light. And if we get something in the middle there, like one of my favorite grays is 52, 52, 52. That's going to be some shade of gray. Which is pretty cool. Right, so we get this color mixing, and it's a whole lot different from the kind of things that we're used to. So there is that. And we can use these colors in the exact same way that we were using colors previously. Like if we look at this and we see, oh, look at that. There's our hexadecimal color in action, utilizing the color syntax. So we can go over to our site that we're working on. And let's make the font color in our big paragraph that green. Right? So that's our hashtag big element ID here. We can zoom in on that. Now let's say color is hashtag 7B9618. And that's going to turn that into that gross green color that we've been using. On a real website here, that's not necessarily the color I would use, just because it is kind of hard to read. But for us practicing, that's great. Just so you can see it, I'll go ahead and throw this. Go ahead and throw this up here. Right, this is the technical formula for what we did there in practice. So we can do another one really quickly if we want to do that while we're kind of sitting here. That technical formula for converting these values. Let me just pick another number out of the top of my head. Let's go 621A FC. So we'll go hashtag 621AFC. Now, if you're watching this, and especially if you're watching this later, this might be a good time to kind of pause the video, see if you can figure this out yourself before I do it. Maybe think about what color this might be, or might be close to, based on the different values and intensities that we see here. I can already tell you kind of pretty close to what it would be. So you could pause it right here if you're watching this, and if you're here with me live, I'll give you a couple seconds to kind of think about it. and then we'll pick up with it and go from there. All right. So we've got 3 pairs here, just like before. Every time, all 3 pairs are going to be the same. They're going to be red, they're going to be green, and they're going to be blue. So we have 3 different sets of intensities that we can kind of map out here. And we're going to work at them all: 16, 0, 16, 1, 16, 0, 16, 1, 16, 0, 16, 1. And this is, there we go, there we go, there we go. All right, so 2 times 1 is 2. 6 times 16 is 96. So this is 96 plus 2. Our red intensity is 98. Now our A, we said, represents as a 10. Right? So we have 10 times 1 here, which is going to be 10. Plus 1 times 16, which is going to be 16. So what we have here is 10 plus 16, which is going to be 26. 26 is our green value. And then we have our blue value. So our C here, if A is 10, B is 11, C is 12. So this is going to be representative of a 12. F is a 15. And so it's going to be 15 times 16, which is equal to 240. So this is going to be 240 plus 12. That is 252. Just slightly off from being full intensity. So now we can start to see where we're at here in terms of intensities and what this color can be. It's almost full intensity blue, so we know it's going to be somewhere in the blue family. We have more red than green, so it might be a little more purple. So I'm expecting this to be like somewhere between like a very blue purple, maybe like a royal blue, or, you know, like a... It's kind of hard to describe. You know, a nice bright blue with just a little bit of purple in it. And so if we Google that, we can see it. It is 62 1A FC. And we see it right there. Yep, it's a nice bright blue. It's got just a little bit of purple in it, or a little bit of red in it to make it kind of purple. But it's more toward the blue family. And that's really nice. That's what we can expect. So I'm going to take and I'm going to save that color. I have it written down here. We're going to use it in just a minute. Because we need to talk, you know, we've talked about how we work with text colors, but we also need to talk about how we work with background colors, and that's sort of our next thing. Background colors work a lot like our text colors, except we add the background dash modifier before the word color. Right? Remember that color is text color. Just the word color by itself is text color. Background dash color is for a background color. So if we want to change the background color of a whole website, which we'll do now, we do it on the body element in our CSS. So I'll need to write a new CSS selector in here for the body of the site. Right? Remember, you've got the body as your as part of your HTML skeleton, you should have body tags in your HTML. And that body section is the visible portion of your site. So when we use this, we're essentially saying, okay, we'll make the body that color. And so this is going to be background-color. And we'll use that purple blue that we just got, which was 621AFC. We'll add that semicolon at the end. Now we can run that. We can see it in action. Now you can see that that's made a lot of this text kind of hard to read. So what we might want to do is we might want to go into these different sections and change the background color of these different sections. For example, our big, right, we can go in here and we can change background dash color to white. We can use one of those named colors, just like we were doing before. Or we can use the hexadecimal color. Right, let's take and put like a light yellow into here. Into our H1, so it kind of has a light yellow behind it. That'll be background color. We'll go FFFF, so it's full intensity red, full intensity green. We mix green and red together in equal parts, we get yellow. And then we'll put a decent amount of blue in there to bring the lightness of the whole thing up. Let's say like 8.8. For a nice light yellow, which that looks pretty good. We can see that if we do that. Looks pretty nice. Got our white there on that paragraph. We can put a color in here on this paragraph as well. Maybe we'll do like a light gray, right? One of the best grays. Background color. One of the best grays is hashtag CCC. This is the same as saying C0, 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 right? If you leave out a value in one of these pairs, it's going to assume a 0 as the second number. So this is like saying C0, C0, C0. So since we have all of these numbers in equal quantities here, background color CCC, that's a gray color, and we can see that in there like that. Cool. So now let's talk about fonts for just a little bit. Right, now that we have this idea of colors with us, let's talk about fonts. By default, we get this Serif Font. A Serif Font is one of the fonts that has these little jagged edges on it. See these jagged edges here? You know, if we kind of circle them, you know, that got that little jaggy there, got that little jaggy there, there, you know, got all these little jaggies all over this font. That makes this what we call a serif font. Those little jaggies are called serifs. We also have sans serif fonts. And for our purposes, we'll be looking at fonts by way of web-safe fonts in terms of the fonts that we can change with in future classes for those of you who continue the programming and web development degree. You'll use different, you know, I'll teach you how to use different types of fonts in different places. But by default, you know, just kind of like how we had that list of colors that every browser kind of understands, we have a list of fonts that every browser kind of understands that we can use here. And we see that some of them are sans serif fonts, some of them are serif fonts, and we have a monospace font and a cursive font. We'll talk about what all these are in just a second. But, you know, the thing that we get by default is our serif font. Specifically, Times New Roman is that font that we get by default. And so that's the font that we see on our site now. Let me refresh this so we get our updated colors. That's Times New Roman. That's the font that you use for like your APA formatted papers and all that kind of fun stuff. But actually, a sans serif font is easier to read on the web. And so we can see these fonts here, like Arial. Arial is a sans serif font. There aren't any of those jaggies sticking off of any of the characters. Verdana, we see that here. Helvetica, Tahoma, and Trebuchet MF, or MS. These are all of our sans serif fonts that are web safe, that our browsers just kind of understand by default. Then we have our serif fonts. We have Times New Roman, which is our default font. Georgia, which is another serif font. You can see the little jagged pieces. And Garamond. Courier New is what we call a monospace font. And when we say monospace here, essentially what we mean is that we can essentially draw a box around each character, and each character is going to take up the same amount of space in the line. And then a cursive font looks like it's kind of handwritten. Right, so if I want to change the font of my website, I've been on a bit of a Verdana kick lately. If I want to change the font of the whole website, just like if I'm changing the background color of the whole website, I'm going to do it on the body element selector here. And so in order to change the font, we use a CSS property called font-family. And we can see here in our IDE, we get a bunch of these choices here. I want to use Verdana. So I'm going to type in the term Verdana there in quotes. And I also want to add what we call a fallback font. And a fallback font is if for whatever reason this font fails to load, it'll fall back to this second font. And so as my fallback font, I'm just going to type sans serif. So if Verdana, for whatever reason, fails to load, then the page will just load whatever the user's default sans serif font is. Typically on Windows, that's Arial, and on a Mac, that is Helvetica. So we can run that now, and we can see our font change, and that looks a lot nicer. Right, just by default, that looks a lot nicer. Because as we've said, serif fonts are easier to read online. So now let's talk about some of the other things that we can do with text in terms of text formatting. And we'll go through these kind of quickly. Right, we have these different things here. We have text alignment, text decoration, text transformation, text indentation, and line height. Another thing that I don't really have listed here is font size. So let's look at font size really quickly. I can change the font size of an element by using my font size property. So if I say target my H1 here, I'm going to add a font dash size. In future classes, we'll teach you how much, what a lot of these different values are here. For right now, while we're learning, we're just using pixels. So I want to do something that's way bigger than a regular H1, so we'll say 64 pixels here. Add that semicolon at the end. And that'll just take and make that font a whole lot bigger. And we can see that there like that. And so we can use this font dash size to make our font bigger, make our font smaller, whatever we want to do with it. So the next thing is text alignment. And that's what we use to do just simple aligning of text. Right, so if I want to center text up as opposed to centering a box up, I can just set my text dash align property to be centered. And it'll work just fine. We get left, right, centered, or justified. In our case, the values are left, right, center, or justify. But we can do all of these with text. One of the important things to note is that if things are center aligned, or if things are default alignment is different based on the language that you're typing in. Right, because like we speak English, we use the English language. English language is read from top to bottom, from left to right. But there are other languages that are read from right to left. There are other languages even still that are read from top to bottom. So it's important to note that kind of how some of these things work depends on the language that's being used. And that is something that you have to define in CSS, but for our purposes, it's pretty easy because we can just use the default. We see the examples of this syntax here. And we can just align something centered. For example, if we wanted to take, like I like having this bar nice and big here at the top, but I want to take this hello world text and move it to the center. So in my H1, I can just add a text dash align center property there. Click run. And it'll center my hello world up. When you're looking at justify, what justify does is it essentially changes the spacing between the words to make all the lines even. Right? So like if you see this paragraph here, our big paragraph, if we were to follow the right-hand margin, it's jaggy. It kind of goes in and out like that. If we were to justify them, all of these lines here would be even, and then we'd come in here. Right? So we can look at that by going, finding our big, and text dash align justify. And we can see that in action there. All lined up on that right-hand side. And you can kind of see, if you look closely, that all of the spacing between the words there is a little bit different on each line to make that happen. We'll run through a couple other of these just really quickly. These aren't as important to our module here. I just kind of wanted to tack them on. So we'll run through one or two more really quickly until we hit our hour mark here. For example, text decoration. We can use our text decoration to set or remove decorations from text. Text decoration none is often used to remove underlines from links, but one of the things that we'll talk about in future courses is the fact that we want our links to have underlines on them so people know that they're links. That's kind of important. So while we can do that, we probably shouldn't. But we can see some examples of this here. Overline, line through, underline. One of the interesting things that we can actually do is we can add two of these properties here. Like if I wanted to put a little line above and below hello world here. In my H1, I could add a text dash decoration, overline, underline. And that will put both an overline and an underline onto a singular element there, just so we have another little bit of decoration. Remember that when we're using these text decorations here, our CSS is non-semantic. So these text decorations don't really have any meaning. If you want to emphasize the text, you would still have to use some of the things that we talked about earlier, like the emphasis tag or the mark tag or the strong tag. But you could, if you wanted to emphasize text, you could create a style rule for, say, your strong tags, where you also put an underline underneath it, so anything that has a strong tag wrapped around it would also have an underline. I think the last one we'll look at for today is line height, and that's where we can add more space between the lines. Right? In print design, we call this leading, because back in the day, when the standard manual printing press was how you printed things, if you wanted more space between lines, you would put strips of lead in between your typeset rows to increase that space. So here, this is how we essentially double space a document, single space a document. By default, the value is 1. That is the standard line height. And then we can make it bigger or smaller based on what we add as our line height here. So the .small class that you see here has a 0.8 line height, which is essentially the normal line height times 0.8, so it gets a little smaller. The large line height here is line height of 1.8, so it's the normal line height times 1.8, so it gets bigger, almost double spaced. Right, so we can add our line height property here. I'm going to focus our P1. And I'm going to add line-height. And the rule of thumb is, like, the longer your lines are, the more line height you might need. I'm going to say 1.6. And so that's essentially taking the standard line height, multiplying it by 1.6. And clicking run, you can see that extra bit of space between the lines now. It's probably more apparent when we do it here. For double spaced, I'm going to change that to 2. So that's the normal line spacing times 2. So that's a double line space. We could also go backwards with it, like we could make it smaller. Like if we look at our big here, and we say line dash height 0.5. That's taking the regular space between the lines, multiplying it by half, which means that our lines are going to start to run together because we're going half the size of the regular line height. So typically we always want to make this bigger so it's easier for us to read. But we have a lot of options there. So that's all that we're going to talk about today. And we ran through a lot of stuff there, but it is a video, so you can go back and watch it multiple times if you'd like. I'm going to hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes here, just in case anybody has any questions. If you're watching this later and you have any questions, please email me or Teams me so that I can answer your questions. If you have specific questions about code that you've already written, it helps to go ahead and include your code, just so we're both on the same page, right? Like if you send me a question like, "Hey, I'm having trouble with my code," but you don't send me your code, to where I have to send you back a message that's like, "Okay, send me your code," right? Like that's just like wasting time for both of us. So you want to, if you have specific questions about code that you've already written, you want to go ahead and send me that code when you are asking the question. But that is all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.